I talk for a second?
Excursion into
Coaching. Excellent. We're, well, not live, but live. The two of us talking.
yeah.
Here we are talking about coaching, and I'm here today with Tessa Dodwell. Tessa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Yannick.
I'm excited to talk to you today. I know I say that a lot, but I'm particularly excited to this one. And this is also something I say a lot. But the reason being that we started connecting about you researching a sense of identity in coaching, particularly around transitions into retirement. And I'm not sure, I can't remember. It was quite a while ago that we connected and said we wanted to have a conversation.
Yes.
But it's certainly topics that excite me because I meet that in my coaching a lot, not just in transition into retirement, but transition generally, and the sense of identity just being so relevant and so crucial underneath many of the decisions that coaching clients make in their work. So
Definitely.
That immediately got me excited. When you said you've done some research into this, I got extra excited. And now we're sitting here talking.
I know. It was probably about 2 years ago. Actually, the reason I reached out to you was I was looking for candidates for my research. And I thought an existential coach would be an ideal person, and probably got lots of people who are going through retirement. So, yeah, that's why we connected.
I remember. Yes, I thought you got some research candidates at the time. I remember at the time I was absolutely swamped, and I would have loved to take part. But I hope I got you some people.
Oh yeah, no, I did. Yeah.
Well, before we get into that, I'd love to just kind of put a frame around where you're coming from into this. Mm-hmm. A question that I love to ask at the beginning of these podcasts often is, well, what do you tell people at a dinner party, or like when people say, "Oh, what do you do?"
Mm-hmm. Well, for a long time, it was a very different job. I was heading up a logistics company. So I was an account director, and I used to run the warehousing and logistics. And then I was introduced to coaching when I was in the senior team. And this was about 10 years ago. And I had a team of about 500 at the time. And I cascaded what I'd learned on, I did my ILM level 5. Mm-hmm. And I cascaded what I learned to my team, and it was electric. It was absolutely fascinating, and I couldn't quite believe it. We were already getting really good scores anyway on all of our performance, but then they just got kind of world beating, and I just thought there's something amazing in this. And it wasn't just the performance, but it was the energy and the enthusiasm from my team. And they would go away at weekends and develop products to come in and make their work life better. So it was just lovely to see that real energy and enthusiasm. So the first opportunity, I left corporate world and took my master's at Oxford Brookes. And since then, I've set up 2 businesses, one where I work with individuals who are going through transitions, and the other where I'm working with 2 colleagues that I met on the MA. And we are working with corporates, executives, and we're doing, for every one piece that we do with them, we are also offering something to a cause for free. So we've got that
great.
kind of balance. So so North 52 is taking up most of my time. So we're 1 year anniversary on Friday. It was so.
All right, congratulations!
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm a bit of all things at the moment.
Mm-hmm. So tell us about the coaching angle that comes into your work, because there's a lot there that has a lot of potential for having these kind of conversations. I'm sure you've had a lot of these conversations. Tell us a bit how you bring that in.
So in terms of coaching, I'm very fascinated with transitions, I guess, because when I came out of corporate life, I found that quite a difficult transition, and the whole sense of identity piece, I'd actually been quite invested in my work. So when I left and people asked me, "What do you do?" I didn't know how to respond, and I wasn't sure who I was anymore. And I felt like what I've experienced by talking to people who went to retirement, that whole experience of not knowing who I was, I experienced when I came out of corporate life. But what happened and got me through was that I knew that I wanted to go into the world of coaching. So it was kind of reforming that coach identity. Took probably about a year to do that. But now, obviously, I'm very comfortable in that skin. But my preference is to work with people who are going through big life transitions, because it's a comfort zone for me, and I really understand it well now, having been through it, but also researched it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So you have do you have your own coaching practice? You've
Yes.
researched this, and tell us a bit about your style, your perspective on coaching. How did you train? Is there a particular school of thought that you follow, or what informs your coaching practice?
So my training, as I say, I did a master's at Oxford Brookes, and they very much evidence-based practice is central. And in terms of a particular school, which is why I reached out to you, is I'm very interested in existential coaching. And I love the power of thinking about those existential anxieties and how that can really kind of boost you in your current present day thinking. So depending on my clients, I will, if I can, go down the route of asking some deep and meaningful questions about their existence, to really prompt that kind of focus on today and how they can move towards where they want to get to. So definitely feel that that's probably the area of coaching that informs me most when I'm talking about transitions.
Yeah, it's amazing how people try to keep work and personal life very separate, when their sense of purpose and value and meaning in their existence, I don't think I think it's inseparable from what we do for work. And yet there's this real effort to put this divide up.
Definitely. And I think that's what confuses people, I think, when work ends and it's just all kind of personal life. And if they haven't really thought that through and not had those kind of goals in there outside of their work life, it's really kind of unsettling.
Yeah, who am I without the thing that used to define my life for, probably more than 8 hours a day, sense of status. There's so much involved. And especially during the pandemic, I've had that in my coaching certainly a lot, that people were either sitting at home on furlough, or they've lost their job, or they've lost their entire industry. And they're thinking, who am I now sitting in this void? And sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, you see this with people whose roles are really well, that mean that their lifestyle is their role. So people like doctors or priests, where they're really embedded in their role, and people in the community see them as the doctor, the priest. Then they find that really difficult to disengage and move to kind of life without that badge.
Yeah. And you started your research with a quote by Kierkegaard, which is a popular existential philosopher, one of the first who wrote about this kind of perspective. And I just wanted to read it to people, and I'm curious why you started this or used this to set the scene. So maybe you can give it some context and see a few more words. The quote goes, "The greatest hazard of all, losing one's self, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all. No other loss can occur so quietly. Any other loss, an arm, a leg, $5, a wife, etc., is sure to be noticed."
Yeah, I really like that quote, because it for me, it really emphasized that sense of how important that loss was, that sense of loss. And it really captured that kind of deep loss that people feel. And it really is, it's quite unsettling and quite uncomfortable. And I think I go on to use other quotes like I think someone says it's like walking off a cliff, this sense of helplessness. So, it really is quite a deep feeling that people have. And I think he captured it really well in sort of saying, it really is one of the most dramatic losses that you can feel. And just really to raise attention that this transition to retirement is actually quite a serious life chapter, and for people to really take it quite seriously, because my experience has been that certainly among some of my friends and colleagues, they just haven't thought about it, deliberately haven't thought about it. And I guess it's just kind of bringing it into focus as something that really we should all be thinking about.
Yeah, the quietness of it is a really interesting one to me, because often when people talk about an existential crisis, and when we lose our jobs, or when, there is a significant transition, could also be any significant ending, could be ending of a relationship or ending of a decade, around birthdays are sometimes such a transition.
Yes.
We always imagine this as this big bang, as this big crisis, as this thing that hits us in the face and now we're falling. But actually, I think more often than not, it comes creeping in. It comes very quietly, and all of a sudden, the day is here and we're no longer working, or something has changed. Relationships don't often end with a blow and an incision. Often relationships end over time, and if we don't pay attention to it, rather quietly, all of a sudden we realize something has changed, and it's not like it was anymore, and something has been lost. And then there is an incision where there is a decision that we're no longer working together. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think yes, the quietness was a lovely quote, because exactly as you say, I think people, there's research that says that whole process can take about a year, and the noticing that you've lost your sense of self is really quite a slow process, and then it can take a long time to really reestablish that. Yeah.
So tell us about the process as you've experienced it, or as you've seen it in your coaching, or as it emerged through your research. There seems to be something that perhaps coaches can use to be aware of what's going on, or something that coaches can learn when they support somebody through this kind of transition.
Yeah, well, it was very interesting, because I originally was going to look at some of the models and see how they could apply or not to my research. So I looked at some of the change models and some of the people like Bridges, seeing whether there was this kind of pattern of endings, neutral beginnings, see if that applied. And what was quite interesting is, although that did apply, what was very different with retirement is there was this phase that Procresta and De Clementi have in the kind of addiction work that they did, that there was this pre-contemplation phase where people knew they were going to retire, and they had this kind of opportunity to choose whether to think about it or to not think about it. So whereas I think Bridges, there's much more a reaction to a change that happens. What I sensed with retirement, it was there was a sort of step before that where you had this opportunity to think about how you were going to be and what you were going to do post-retirement.
Right. Can I just pause there or go a little bit deeper? Because first of all, I just wanted to underline the importance of having a choice to think about something or not. The stages of change model starts with pre-contemplation. And I remember the first time I found that, come across it, it seemed to me as if that's the stage where you don't think about it. Because it's pre-contemplation. In a way it is, but I think it's so important that you present it as there's a choice to think about it or not. Because I think we like to push that out of our awareness because it's uncomfortable to think about a big change. And so a lot of people, it takes a bit of courage to think about something that is a big change.
Yes, no, so definitely.
If you could say a little bit more about a brief summary of what the two change models are about, because I think people who are listening to this are probably like, what, De Clementi and who? And for us, it's basic change. Like, we come from an evidence-based coaching approach. We're like, of course we are familiar with change models, but I think a lot of coaches are not. So I think it might be really valuable to just kind of lay them out briefly.
Yeah, so I always get this name. Is it Procasta and De Clemente?
Yeah, that's
yes.
it.
So they looked at people who were going through addiction, and they looked at basically what happened to people regarding their approach to changing and to moving away from their addiction. And they actually came up with a cyclical model, because obviously a lot of people with addiction do go back through that cycle again. But it starts with this phase of pre-contemplation where we've just said, there's a choice to think about it or not. Then you go on to contemplation. And then actually the stages do quite mirror what Bridges has got, which is basically this kind of ending phase where you kind of recognize that you are going to put to bed your prior kind of addiction in that case. But in Bridges' case, he actually looked at it from a business point of view. And when businesses are going through transformation, there's a conscious decision that we're going to move on from where we were. So that's kind of the endings piece. Then there's this neutral phase where they talk about kind of being in limbo, where you kind of like, people are perhaps not, that their minds haven't quite engaged with the new system, but the new system might actually be in place. So perhaps the company has changed its name, you've all got a new IT system, all the kind of functional things have happened. But inside people's minds, they're still kind of wedded to the old way things were, and they're not quite into the new company as it's kind of perhaps taking shape. So there's this kind of no man's land where they're kind of neither the old company nor the new company, trying to get used to that phase. And then there's the beginnings where they start to accept, the new phase and engage with all the changes and feel more comfortable with the change in themselves. So going back to the addiction model, that's essentially what happens. They change from being, in an addict phase to moving out into having a different, healthier lifestyle. But then again, they've got that choice then as to whether they continue on that great path or they don't go back to addiction.
Yeah, that's the most important phase of any change model, I think, is how do we maintain it? One of my early lecturers always joked that, quitting smoking, it's a change that's very easy. I make it 20 times a day.
Yeah, very good.
So maintaining a change, that's where most people struggle and most people don't really succeed. And then they flip back into the cycle.
Yes. Yeah, very common. Yeah.
I imagine that to be different with retirement.
Yes, you haven't got a lot of choice. Well, actually, nowadays, the transition to retirement is a lot less pronounced. There's a lot, people are quite often unretiring now. So they go into retirement and then they come back out. Or they're taking a new career, doing something completely different. I think now it's a lot more fluid than it used to be. And one of the kind of questions I asked myself when I was doing the research, is this all pointless? Because actually, will retirement transition even exist in the future?
Yeah. Yeah, because there's so many jobs we can do. There's so much work we can do, even though we're out of the official system.
I think it's interesting because when I asked myself that question, I think actually a lot of the emotion, I'll run through the findings at some point, but all of those findings, I think actually will still apply. They just might be in a different timing or in a different sequence to what we saw in the research. I do think we will go through a transition, but it might be from our kind of main role to perhaps more subliminal roles.
Yeah. So we started with what that process kind of looks like in a transition. So you say change models influence and inform that, and you kind of went to look at what's applicable and where might it go beyond it. But could you continue just laying out that process into of transition?
Yes. So in terms of what I started to see then in the research, and the way I approached this is it was an interview. It was very fluid, very open, and it was just talk me through, what happened in your retirement. So talk me through the phase prior to retirement, what happened when you retired, and what's happened since. And they were all sort of self-defined as retired about 1 year post-retirement. And I wasn't looking really for a chronological, a model to pop out or anything, but there really was a dramatic difference between pre-retirement and post-retirement in terms of how they presented themselves and what their thinking was and what their issues were. So pre-retirement, this whole thing about planning retirement and the choice to think about retirement, apart from one person actually chose to do that. Everyone else was kind of, something had triggered them to think about it. So their natural choice, which comes back to my existential thinking, is that their natural choice was to avoid thinking about this. And I think there's a lot of research to back that up, that, I think it's something like 56% of people have done no planning at all for their retirement. So, that's quite common, not to think about it. So planning itself, triggering that planning, is quite important for people pre-retirement. And then when they start thinking about it, it's really quite a shallow thinking that goes on. Oh, I'm going to do more golf. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go and travel there. It's all kind of things they're going to do, and people they're going to see. So it's all quite kind of functional and not much thought behind it. It's just, I want to do those things.
This is a classic where the coach provides value just with some very basic curiosity. It's like, oh, how would that look like? Or, who would that be? Or do you have a list? What do you mean by? And then all of a sudden, how many people stay at that shallow level? And just being faced with like 5-6 questions, they're already opening up a lot of stuff to talk about.
This is it. And I think, a lot of these people pre-retirement didn't get that opportunity to talk to coaches. In fact, the only people pre-retirement that I spoke to either had like a group retirement course, where obviously there's not too much that's going to happen in a group environment where you're going to feel comfortable to open up. So not many things. It was quite a transactional kind of experience for them. But the only people that did attend coaching pre-retirement were those who had what I deemed unexpected events. So things like a bereavement, redundancy, or one person ended up going through a tribunal. And all those things had a triggering effect for them to start thinking about their future. And I think as coaches, very often we don't have to even mention the word retirement. We just talk about, what does the plan look like for the next 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be. But it's, there's a lot of research that says that even if you don't stick with the plan, just having a plan can really help satisfaction levels post-retirement. Yeah. So, I found that really interesting, that the importance of a plan was far more than I kind of felt it should be. So, yeah. Yeah,
and I think how many people are scared to make a plan because it might not work out exactly like that. But it's the same with a business plan, it just offers direction. And making a plan that is like detailed enough to offer a purposeful movement, but like you're not too attached to it so that you can let it go when things change.
Exactly.
And what a beautiful opportunity. Like it's ideal for group coaching settings, right? If there's not this particular event, but even if there is, I imagined a group immediately as you were talking of people where retirement is coming up just because of age and company policy, and just getting together with people who are in a similar situation and just sharing some of their hopes, dreams, just talking about it. I think a partner often naturally does that. Often naturally they don't. And as a friend, I would naturally be curious. So what's after, What are you excited about? But I think a lot of people are not in that position, that they have people around them who would engage them in those conversations. And what a fantastic thing in a group. I imagine the group life to be continuing way beyond the group coaching setting, just because people go through a similar experience together.
Yes, and actually the group kind of retirement sessions that seem to have the most positive feedback were those where they brought in basically a mentor, someone who'd already been retired, to talk to the group. And it just gave them different perspectives on retirement, and that brought things up that they hadn't really thought about. And I think when you start thinking about retirement for the first time, it's something you wouldn't have been through before. So it's always good to have different perspectives to start giving you some ideas. So I think they were well received, but it was much more that those acted as a trigger for their own personal thinking, rather than them doing an awful lot of thinking in the session.
Right. Okay. So do you run groups like that?
Well, I'm looking to do that. Yeah, definitely. So retirement webinars is something that I'm building as a sort of model to do that, because there are not many. I spoke to the big four who do run retirement sessions, but again, it's kind of like a lot of these things are. It's internally created. It's not evidence-based. There's no research behind it. They're not evaluated. So there's a lot more that can be done to kind of make those really robust and thought-provoking sessions. So that's definitely something I'm working on. The other thing on the planning, which I found really interesting, and the approach that I took was I did Georgie's descriptive phenomenology in terms of my method, which forces you to put aside your own presumptions and assumptions, and to note, and I diarised them as I went through. And one of my assumptions was the people that I was talking to, they were all executives, high flyers, and I credited them with a lot of intelligence and a lot of forethought. And, I thought these guys were going to know exactly what their financial position was going to be post-retirement. And, I was astounded to learn that nobody understood their financial position. And I know that there's all this kind of, financial advice that we're offered in terms of pension advice. And we know that there's a kind of, the market could crash, and, we know that there's some variability, but they really didn't understand the extent of that variability. And therefore, could it be 20% either way? Could it be 10%? They just had no figure to hang their planning on. So this was a real barrier for people to do any planning post-retirement, because they just had no sense of what their financial position would be. And this one guy was telling me about how he was literally sat on the stairs waiting for his pension check to arrive through the post to see what the amount would be and whether he could live on it.
Wow.
It was just
what a moment.
I had this picture of him, like I can remember waiting for my GCSE results in the same kind of way, and that real kind of agonizing, is it going to be what I need? I think there's a lot more that pension companies can do to really allay those fears, because every single person had this fear of insufficiency. And these are all, very successful people. And it was less about whether some of them were worried about whether they could live on it, but some were just, what kind of lifestyle am I going to be able to live now? Do I need to one lady was saying, do I need my husband and my daughter to spend less? Do I need to get rid of my horses? I don't know, because I just have nothing tangible to hang my future on.
But you can't find out in the UK, or is it just something they didn't look into?
No, what happens is, most people will engage their financial advisors, but financial advisors do not like to say your pension will be X. And I think there's some laws that say that they can't actually commit to a number. So they, rather than saying, the range could be, 10%, it's likely to be this number, but you might be 10% down, you might be 10% up. But the likelihood is going to be this. they rather than saying that, they just give them very little. They're saying, oh yeah, the market's doing quite well. You might be this, or, you know, they just don't give them anything tangible.
Right.
So yeah, I meet with my pension advisor a lot, and I'm constantly asking him questions to pinpoint things. But as one guy described it, very slopey shoulder. They don't like to commit to a number.
Right. Wow. There's another huge existential lens here of living with uncertainty.
Yes, definitely. And it's interesting how that made the impact that had on everything else was quite overwhelming for them, because I think that was partly the reason they didn't want to think about it, because they didn't want to be in that position where it might actually be a bad news story for them. But also that thought that all that traveling that they might be hoping for wasn't actually feasible with their income. So there's this kind of, I don't really want to know kind of feeling. So yeah, that was interesting. So that was kind of the pre-retirement phase, if you like. So lots of thinking, but not much more about what they were going to do rather than how they were going to be. And then come retirement, in terms of, you know, Kubler-Ross's grief cycle and that response to, you know, having bad news, there was a lot of kind of following of that cycle.
Could you just run through the stages again for people who might not be familiar with this grief cycle?
I need a book to do that. Hang on a moment. I've got it here.
I just found a wonderful meme that a friend sent me about winter in Berlin and the stages of winter.
Oh, that's
which
a
follow
nice
the same follow the same model.
Okay, well maybe you should start me off then.
Denial.
Yes. First of all, denial, definitely. And I'm just trying to find it now. Where are we? Oh, it's not where I thought it was being. No, I can't find it. So yeah, denial. Yes, here we are. So yes, then anger. Yeah. Then there's this phase that I'm looking at. This is Jenny Rogers' interpretation of Kubler-Ross. There's this bargaining phase where you're trying to kind of adjust your anger. And then quite often there's a low phase with depression before you come back up to kind of accepting what's going on.
Yeah. So now imagine this person who walks through the winter, first in like shorts and shirt, you know, still in denial, and then getting angry, and then getting depressed, bargaining with them, and then at some point just accepting it and being sunk deep into the coat.
I like that.
That's love
brilliant.
that.
That will help me remember it in the future. Yeah, so there was that sense of all those emotions at that point of retirement. So there was a lot of people that exhibited all of those.
So how does that show up? I mean, I'm sure when people either come to coaching, I mean, when they come to coaching, I guess if you're like, ideally you would get a coach as you know that's going to come. But I reckon in reality, probably a lot of clients would come to coaching when they're in the thickness of the depression or the bargaining, or, you know, when the pain started. What's your experience with that?
So the people where I was able to see that happening were those that had engaged a coach pre-retirement to sort out. So they'd had these unexpected events. So those guys, you could see them going through that cycle because they were already engaged with a coach. For those that didn't have a coach, the only post-retirement coaches that were kind of offered by companies were outplacement coaches. And these tended to be very transactional, sort of helping them with their CVs, getting back into the job market, looking at kind of NED roles and non-exec roles. So it was basically down to the individuals to choose the point at which they felt they needed a coach. Because a lot of them dropped their outplacement coaches. They just didn't feel they were getting enough from them. weren't able to support them in the depth of feeling that they were going through post-retirement. Because, in my experience, post-retirement is when you're really hitting those deeper thinkings and feelings and starting to really evaluate and life appraise. And having an outplacement coach just wasn't cutting it for these guys. They wanted someone they could really, talk through some of these deeper issues with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So why I'm just thinking, why should companies invest in retirement coaching? There's a million good reasons, but also, as somebody who's sitting in HR thinking about investing in coaches, I could also imagine them thinking, well, they're leaving the company, so why should I invest in them?
Well, interestingly, not many companies do this, but there are some people who use their retirees to support onboarding of their graduates, etc. And, there's a huge amount of wealth for people that have been in a company for a long time. There's a lot of rich experience that can be imparted to people that are just starting within the company. So companies that invest in their retirees can get a real benefit in terms of onboarding and getting people familiar with the company. But I guess it's quite interesting to ask, at what point does the duty of care finish for an organization? And a lot of people do assume you walk out the door, but that those people are going out into the world with the reputation of your company in their hands. So it is worth you I guess offering a graceful exit and an exit where they feel really appreciated and valued. I think one of the things that came through was a real distaste about how they were treated, and these are all people that had been in their companies for a long, long time, and had a wonderful relationship with their HR department. But when it came to them leaving, it was felt they were dropped quite quickly. And the whole process is quite, there's not much of kind of inviting people back in to do talks. There's not that kind of continued engagement in any sense in a lot of companies. So there's a real anger about how some of them were treated. So I do think HR departments can learn quite a lot from their exit interviews. And I would suggest doing exit interviews somewhere down the line as well.
Yeah, follow-up exit interviews. Because especially when we talk about this through an identity lens, somebody who's worked for, maybe even decades at a company that they're now leaving. But I think anything over a decade gives you a serious sense of identity through this company. And if you're then just being dropped, that sense of identity really changes. But I mean, you can always be, for example, when I left the university, somebody once told me, you'll always be the former program leader of this MSc. That's nothing that anybody can ever take away from you. And I'm like, oh, because that sense of loss was significantly less as soon as I had understood that. It's like, that's true. That's always going to be part of my identity. I'm not sure to what extent I'm going to put that out there. But like a former professor, former politician, former presidential candidate, that's all going to be with you. And if you leave a company well and they support you as you're leaving the company, it doesn't even have to be, we're going to keep you involved with more work, even though you've retired. But even just like making that transition easier for you, being well taken care of, you're going to take that brand name and you're going to promote it, because you're going to tell the story. And people are like, oh, how is it like to be retired? It's like, oh, I've been working with this coach and I've been building all of this and I've been, I'm having meaningful things to do. And I was asking myself some questions that I hadn't really asked myself before. That's going to reflect so well on the organization, especially in the climate of the new millennials looking for more meaning and purpose and being taken care of.
Yes, exactly. I think there's so much more that companies could do. And it's very interesting that, all of them felt that nobody did enough And some of them were found other roles within the company. And, the company felt like they were doing something for them. But interestingly, even the whole bridging techniques, where, you offer them another role, they felt sidelined. They felt that they weren't able to contribute to decisions like they used to be able to. So even like HR thinks they're doing a great thing by offering them another role within the company, but actually, one guy who was a lawyer was reporting that really damaged him, because he felt like he was no longer valued. Nothing he said had any value anymore, because of the role that they placed him in.
So they offered him a shit role, basically.
They offered him a shit role which had no influence and no impact. Right. So he, from being very impactful because he was one of the partners, to having no impact. Right. It was, really big change for him. Trying
to do something in potentially good faith, even, just led to the opposite of what it was meant to do.
Exactly.
So what is enough? What does it look like to do enough in the eye of the people that you've interviewed?
Well, I think one of the things that I think the actual trigger point is really important. So actually triggering that thought, I would suggest, needs to happen a lot earlier. Mm-hmm. So potentially when people hit 50, when they may not even be thinking about their retirement, because what people were saying was that most of the retirement courses were held within the last 6 months before they were leaving. And people hadn't thought about their companies as being a vehicle to help them in their post-retirement life. So there's one lady who was telling me she went on to be a chair of some committees post-retirement, but she'd never chaired before. And she said, if I'd have thought this through, I would have got some experience chairing meetings within my company, because there were plenty of opportunities for me to do that. I just didn't even think about it. So I think triggering a lot earlier and giving people that opportunity to upskill if they want to within the company environment will be absolutely invaluable to them valuing the company for investing in them, but also to set them up so that they've got something tangible post-retirement. I think some people having that role that goes pre to post, that bridge role, is really, really helpful for some, and having something that continues across so that they don't have that big change or in how they're spending the time. There's something that's continuing through for them. Mm-hmm. So that would help kind of bring them that opportunity. But I think post-retirement, I think it's about, what one guy was saying, it's not like overnight we kind of lose all of the information that we've got. It's not like one day we wake up and we haven't got all of this experience and knowledge. It's just like, what a waste, they're saying. I've got all of this information. What are you doing as a company to extract that out of me, to use it for better good? And, some people didn't even have a retirement interview. And there was one guy who said there was an appraisal coming up. And because he was retiring, they said, oh, no, you don't need to do an appraisal. And he was like, what do you mean? And he demanded to do the appraisal. But there's this kind of real sense that they're just, right, they're out of here now. We don't need to think about them anymore. So really valuing what they're saying. I think the other thing that organizations could do better on is the language. I think that there's a real resistance about some of the ageist language. So, using the word pensioner or, talking about retirement even can be seen as if people aren't ready to accept that they're going into that phase, they can really resist those labels.
Well, that would make me old. I'm not old.
Exactly.
I don't feel old.
And that's what they all said. Nobody feels old. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think as we all age externally, internally, we don't feel that same kind of aging. We all still feel quite young in our heads, and it's no difference for these guys that are retiring. And there was one lady who received a letter from the company that said, "Dear pensioner," And she went ballistic. She said, I know I'm taking a pension, but I'm not a pensioner.
Wow, what the association.
Yeah, exactly. So, using different language and just not stereotyping that because you're old, you're expendable. That kind of sense was really coming through.
It's going to be really interesting to see how this is going to be socially constructed going forward. Because like Instagram influencers in their mid-20s looking forward to retiring in 10 years.
Yeah.
and then they're going to be retired, but they're not going to be pensioners.
Yes, exactly. And there are a lot of those guys coming through now. But what's interesting now is in the UK, they're not stipulating your retirement age anymore. Mm-hmm. And so what impact is that going to have? Because if you naturally don't think about retirement and you haven't got a trigger to consider it, and there's no date for you now to hold on to, are we just going to end up with this problem where people aren't exiting and then people can't come through into those roles because they're all full?
This is so interesting because here, if the government, for example, or companies tell you at what age you have to be retired, or a range by which you can be, they're offering a narrative for you to define yourself at different stages in your life. And if they don't do that, existentially very interesting, we have to choose at which point we adopt that label. And I guess that comes into your perspective on this as well, around how do we narrate our own identity. So could you say a bit more about how this relates to a sense of self, especially the loss of it, and what we might be able to do as coaches to support somebody going through this?
Yeah, so one of the I guess when you look at a lot of transitions, there is this lost sense of identity, as you mentioned earlier. Losing relationships, bereavements, etc., can end up with your lost sense of identity. When children leave home and the parental role is no more, that kind of thing, that can trigger this identity loss. And for all of my retirees, this featured. So there was this sense of loss of who they were. And the role that coaches can play here. And again, I found this really fascinating. Being a coach, I have gone through my values a million times over the years, but lots of people hadn't. And so for some of them, it was the first time that they were A, appraising their life, but B, looking at their values. And for some of them, it was quite disturbing because they realized that the role that they'd been playing for so many years was actually complete opposite to who they were as a person. And there was one lady who said she'd been basically tortured from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night. Because she'd been in an open plan office environment and she was an introvert. And she said, I was, I can't remember the word she used now, but basically she was on tap to anyone to come and talk to her at any point in the day. And because she was in this open office, and she said it was like torture because she was an introvert and she had this for years and years. And she said the calm that she feels now, she just wished she'd have been kinder to herself earlier on and recognized that that wasn't the best environment for her to health-wise, it wasn't a good fit for her.
Wow. So, how long some people wait to ask themselves, who am I? How do I tick? What's important to me? What do I believe in?
Yes.
Amazing.
Again, that was one of my assumptions, was that everyone would have gone through this at some point by the time they've reached retirement. But lots of people haven't. And again, that's HR, I believe, have got a duty of care almost to have those conversations with people really early on in their careers, maybe, so that they've got that sense of whether their role fits who they are. Hopefully with the new generations coming through, they're going to be driving that a lot more. This is the exciting stage, I think, we're in, that more and more companies, more and more HR departments realize that that's how they get the best out of their people. Because I think a lot of HR departments are still very invested to fit the person into the job rather than fit the person and the job so that's a good match. Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, it'd be great to see that happen more, definitely.
Yeah. And fair play, we have so many more people to choose from now for jobs. So I understand that, in other times, the workforce, the number of people who could work for your company was limited.
Yes.
And people weren't relocating so much, and people were much more static, grew up in certain communities and stayed there and then applied for a job locally. And there's so many, with remote work, the flood doors opened into really making fantastic matches with your job, so that those people find themselves meaningfully engaged in something that feels authentic and aligned with their values. So I don't think it's just a millennial thing. I think it's just more people to choose from, better able to match jobs and people together.
And actually, I think that's a positive that's come out of, a lockdown. People have had that opportunity to think more about what they want from their roles, and they've had a taster of what it would be like to work from home. And quite a lot of people are choosing roles that will enable that.
Well, that's quite a transition. And you talked about the introvert. Imagine the extrovert who now has to work remotely. How difficult that is.
Very difficult. Yes, I'm friends with quite a few extroverts, and I know they feed off that energy from other people, and not having it is really damaged some of them. Yeah.
On a very practical level, I was curious, how do you explore values with clients? What's some of your favorite techniques that other coaches might employ?
Well, what I tend to do is I do use my existential lens at this point. So I do talk about legacy, and I talk about, if you think about your eulogy, what would you want people to say about you? And to really, by focusing in on that kind of final speech about your life, I think that can really bring out what's important to you, and start focusing in on how you want to be remembered. But I also used a list of values and get people to try and pull out. There are about well over 100 in there. I get people to try and pull out their top 10 and really justify why they're in their top 10. What is it that really stands out for them? And I think it just helps you with your direction going forwards if you've got a really clear kind of view on what's important to you, and then you can test all these new roles or whatever against that and see whether that is the right fit for you. But yeah, going back to kind of the identity and what else that coaches can do, there are lots of different techniques in terms of identity, ways that you can look at the self. And I like Tatiana's developmental coaching book, Tatiana Bakarova's. Yeah, her book on developmental coaching, and which focuses in on the self and looks at different models that people might hold. This kind of sense that there might just be one self within you or multiple selves within you. Or even if you've, got to kind of flow experience and, perhaps even a Buddhist, and you've got that no self, that sense of no self at all. So I think understanding if coaches can understand what self model someone is working with, that can really tell you whether they're going to struggle more or not. So someone who has multiple selves is likely to be able to reimagine, reshape their future identity much more easily than someone who might think, I'm a doctor and that's the center of who I am, and not having that flexibility.
I'd love to sketch this out a little bit more, bit by bit, because these are the three stories of self, right, that Tatiana talks about. And recently, the parts work, internal family systems, Richard Schwartz's work, is talked about a lot, because it's really challenging this idea that there is one self, because we all have different parts and we all have different selves within us, and they can actually talk to each other. We can talk to them. So I think I found it really liberating in many different ways. And I think in many ways it's probably a solution to this loss of self, if we think that if we adopt the story of self being one thing, identity being this one thing. So could you say a little bit more about what these different models entail and how they might help us in our coaching work?
Yeah, so I guess if you take the model of one person and there is only oneself, then if you can imagine losing yourself, it's very catastrophic. It's it can be really, really unsettling. So what coaches can help people realize is that actually multiplicity is much more palatable in terms of living your life, that you have multiple different selves. And actually, if you think about all the different roles that you play in life, for myself, I'm a mother, I'm a partner, I'm a daughter, I'm a worker, I work as a magistrate. I've got lots of different hats that I put on, and they're different personas. I put on a different persona when I'm with my child to when I'm in court. They're
you can't expect
different.
them to be the same.
No, and I have different ways of being in those two different roles, and ways of thinking. I have to think differently and talk differently. So it's really recognizing that you can, as one person, you can be multiple personalities in multiple identities.
And what pressure to expect of ourselves to be the same set of beliefs and selves in multiple different roles. Of course, we're going to start into conflict.
Exactly. And I think one of the things I ended up actually adding a fourth self model to Tatiana's 3, because one of my coachees was very interesting, because it was like a socially constructed self. So we talked about who she was, and there was for her no core self. And I found that really fascinating. So this is what really sparked my interest in the self and loss of self. She felt like there was no core self, and it wasn't that it was a different self depending on her role. It was different depending on who she was with. So there was like a socially constructed self that completely flowed depending on who she was. So there was no sense of who she was as a person. So I added that fourth one in.
It was a chameleon kind of situation where whenever she was in a particular situation, she would just adapt to what she needed to be in that.
Exactly.
But without a sense of connection to who she felt she was.
Yeah, so she couldn't articulate who she was as a person at all. I found it really hard.
I've had that with a client who had a long history of trauma with narcissistic parents. And she said it's quite common that if you grew up with narcissistic parents, you just adapt to whatever you needed to be in order to survive. So it can often be a trauma response.
That's very interesting, because I think that would have been the case with her, actually. Yeah, very interesting. I didn't realize that. No, that makes sense now. Yeah, that's great. So so those are 3, and then the fourth one, which is, I guess, perhaps on Maslow's hierarchy, it's the right at the top, the search for self-actualization, and this sense that actually you leave the ego at the door, and and in Buddhism, they literally, you get rid of all your possessions and you have no self. So you become one with Buddha. So, there's that, and a really, I'm going to get his name wrong now. The flow experience.
Oh, Csikszentmihalyi.
Thank you.
May he rest in peace. He died a few weeks ago.
Oh, did he? Yeah. I mean, I love his book on Extended Self, but he writes about flow experience. And I guess the most kind of, those of us who don't know Buddhists, the kind of most tangible way that you can see this is when you watch a musician or an artist at work. And you watch them kind of, I call it go. My daughter's a musician and an artist. She goes into the zone. And you just, you can see that there's nothing else in her world other than her work, and you're absolutely absorbed. And that sense of, people who have flow experience, being able to leave everything, all their ego, all the worldly happenings at the door, and just focus on what's in front of them.
Yeah, and that is such a beautiful description of how we can imagine a loss of self, because I think it's difficult to hear somebody say, "Oh, no self." Like, what's that like? And if we're in the zone, if we're so absorbed by what we're doing, and I think everybody, in my experience, almost everybody will be able to identify an experience like that, where we forget to eat, we forget we're hungry, we notice it's gotten dark and we didn't notice it. Or like time just stopped existing, or it flowed very quickly or very slowly. It just really gets distorted, and we're coming out of these experiences with a fantastic feeling. And it is like that's having no sense of self, because the self didn't matter. It didn't come into this activity. We're just merged with what we're doing.
Exactly.
That's not sustainable, though, is it? As a model of self, or how can I imagine that on a prolonged scale? Because couple of minutes, yes, absolutely. Couple of hours, yes, I've experienced that, perhaps with like maybe coming in and out, but like I couldn't imagine that on a permanent level.
I think there are some people, but I reckon it is very, very few that achieve that, and I think these are people that meditate a lot.
That's the enlightened person on the mountaintop kind of stereotype.
Exactly. I think we're talking, probably less than 100 people in the world, a very small number. Just
permanently at one with the universe and everything that's happening around them, with, their ego just kind of stepped back and disappeared.
Yeah. I think it is possible, but it's very hard to do. And like you say, it's much more likely and much more tangible that most people are going to experience it for moments or hours at most. Yeah.
And just kind of to take two steps back, a uni-mind sense of self, like where there's one sense of self, does it have, because we were talking about it, I think we're both fans of acknowledging that there's different selves, but why is that model why does it still exist? What's the benefit of that? What's good about having just one sense of self?
I think,
if anything.
Well, I think the reason it still exists, I think there's quite a lot of science that might have supported that originally, that that there's one brain, and that some of the scientific experiments suggested that your brain does the thinking and your body does the acting, so that kind of connection between the two. But actually, the reason that it still exists is because that's how most of us feel. We feel like we have one authentic self. And the conversations that we have in our head is are talking to ourselves. It feels like there's only one of us. So I think that's why it's kind of sustained as a model, really.
Yeah, also it's simple, and I think there's comfort in its simplicity, that there is this one thing that I am, there I have found the thing, I have found myself. Yeah. Nobody says, "Oh, I found some of myself," and they're very dear to me. So I think people resonate with the idea of I can find it because it's one thing, and then I have this construct around it, and that's me, and I can point to it and describe it. It makes things much more complex when we acknowledge that there's multiple selves, and I think that's what people gravitate to who hold on to that model.
Yes, and I think also actually there was some confusion between having multiple selves and multiple personalities. And
that means you're crazy. You need to go see a shrink, take some medication.
So, some of those, stories about multiple personalities, people kind of therefore didn't want to feel like they have multiple selves. So,
it is a bit scary. I think it takes courage to acknowledge that, I'm a different person when I'm with those people. And what does that make me? Does it make me inauthentic? We always talk about authenticity as this holy grail of, aligning everything in one concept. And it's difficult to hold for many people. It was difficult for me to hold for a long time. How can I be authentic when I'm somebody else in a different situation? I talked with an actor about this, which was fantastic combination. I want to have her on the podcast soon. We talked about how you can be authentic when you're playing a role. Initially we talked about acting. How can you authentically be somebody else that you're clearly not? In a movie or in a play. same thing as how can I be authentic in my job when my job is not fully aligned with my values? I can still show up authentically. How can I show up authentically as a parent holding authority when actually I'm quite against authority? But I know I need to hold good boundaries for the benefit of my child. How can I be authentic in that? Super interesting conversation.
Yeah, no, that's interesting to think about the acting side of it. Yes. Hard.
Yes.
Yes.
So you said there were some, are you finished with the mind, by the way, with a different identity construct?
Sorry, yes, I am. I think so, yes.
Yeah? You said there were some exercises. You wrote about that in your article, that there was some identity finding or identity exploring exercises. Could you tell us about that and how coaches could use it?
Yeah, so I think it is about working with them to understand how they see themselves, and then if they have just one self construct, exploring with them all the different roles they hold and whether potentially there might be some multiplicity going on and whether that's acceptable to them or not, and just exploring that with them and letting them understand that there are other concepts of the self, because like we just said, it's talked about that there is one self more than any other of the concepts. So just allowing them to understand and explore that there might be other ways of being.
Sorry to interrupt, but how can I imagine that in the coaching process? Would there be an element of psychoeducation, or would you contract that this is my process and that part of this we're going to talk about identity, or is it just coming up in conversation? How do you introduce that?
Well, if somebody is talking about authenticity, etc., I will ask the question, are you aware of any other concepts of self? And then if they're saying, well, no, then I will contract to say, shall we talk about other concepts? And that's when I kind of say, according to whoever, and talk through the concepts for them, just for them to kind of see other perspectives. Yeah. Yeah,
I like that, because I think so many coaches, they have been taught not to teach, or not to bring in their own perspective and to really help the client find their own answers. But there's also plenty of coaches out there who say, like, here's a piece of theory, and that often sparks a lot of thoughts. And I see that, especially in positive psychology coaching, that positive psychology coaches are like one of the dominant defining factors of that approach is it's informed by evidence-based science. It's informed by empirical data. And my colleague Susie Green, for example, said we always have an obligation to bring in the science and let our clients think about that. And it sounds that that's a similar approach that you're taking. It's like it's actually really informative to put this on the table for my clients to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of our most important roles as a coach is to offer different perspectives. And, if they are in a position where they haven't got that information at hand, then all I feel like I'm doing is opening their eyes to other ways of thinking.
Yeah, and one of Heron's facilitation styles have been around since the 70s. That's often adopted in coaching as well, is sharing information. It's part of our playing field. It doesn't mean that I'm directive. It doesn't mean that I say you have to believe in the multi-mind because that's going to be the best thing for you, even though I might believe it. But putting some information on the table and letting our clients have a conversation about that with us, think about it in the space that we're holding, I think it's super valid and actually super helpful for many clients when the context feels right for it. Yes, I agree. Yeah. So what else other than perhaps sharing some of this? Are there any specific models or processes or techniques that we can use to help somebody explore their identity? In terms of identity, I guess sometimes it can help to use the chair technique and to explore. Especially when you've got a lost identity from work, you can explore having a conversation with the work identity and perhaps the retirement identity. So explore conversations between your multiple identities. I think that can be quite
helpful, because ultimately what you might be looking to do, depending on where you start up, is to have a completely new identity post-retirement. It could be an old identity that's from your, childhood that is coming out into the fore, or it could be a kind of merging of some of the identities that you already have. It could be a completely recrafting, reshaping of your set of multiple identities. And I think it's very much an exploration phase, the identity bit for me. And there is no one model that is applicable, really. And, I have seen people in all those different kind of coming with all those different self models. And there's not one technique that works better for others. Right. It's just talking through all the options. And it's okay to be changing your identity. It's okay to be developing a new one. And it's okay to kind of feel a loss of one, and it's just talking through, really, I guess, where there is that sense of loss, it's talking to that identity that was, celebrating what they've done and what they've achieved, and how they've integrated. Like you were saying earlier, they are still part of you. They will always be part of you. They are still there, and just that acceptance that it's made you who you are today. But now we're on to a new chapter.
Yeah, I always. There's so many coaches who want to know specific tools and what are the questions that I need to ask. And for me, it's the same thing. Like we're having a conversation here, right? And within that conversation, you'll have the opportunity to explore different perspectives or different ways of doing this. You mentioned chair exercise. This is the empty chair gestalt.
Yes.
If people want to Google that, there's lots out there where you invite your client to sit in an empty chair, bring in an empty chair, and invite them to sit on it, embodying this other part of their identity. I've done it quite a few times. Usually I just talk to that identity. For example, I might say something like, oh, can I talk to the Tessa that's really excited about this next stage for a moment?
Yeah.
And if that's difficult, it can really help to do an empty chair exercise because it literally embodies that. Yes. And Richard Schwartz, I was listening to Greater Than the Sum of Its Parts, which is excellent. It's just a seminar where he talks through and guides you through some of these meditations almost. So there's lots of things out there for the tool hungry or process hungry coach out there to look up. And this is quite amazing. And it doesn't have to get all therapeutic and really separating into split personalities. And, it can feel quite therapeutic and it can feel quite out there. But just like I had a client, for example, for years, we've been working together, and we still talk about, let's call him John 1 and John 2. And John 1 was very type A personality, very much goal getter, very amazingly successful and driven and hungry. And John 2 just wanted to be more in the present, more in the moment, be more mindful, chill. Smoke a spliff and go to a concert, and they two were often fighting,
Yeah.
They also really had a lot to offer to each other, but like it doesn't have to be super complex and breaking it up into certain sets of personality. But it's just acknowledging that one part of me wants this and the other part of me wants that, and sometimes they're fighting for obvious reasons.
And maybe just accepting that there are those two personal, parts to your identity, and not kind of fighting it yourself, not trying to integrate them. Yeah.
So, I'd love to hear more from the part of you that is really grieving about the loss or the ending of your job.
Exactly.
Things like that can help us to just kind of break it up. But also I think sometimes we need to be a bit careful that we're not breaking it up too much, because I think it can be a difficult experience also for somebody to be, if they had a very uni sense of self, to then, feel like, oh, I'm this, how do I bring them together?
Yes.
Did you have that in your work, that maybe a client were drifting too far apart with different parts of their identity and struggling to build a coherent framework of who they are?
So I think coherence is what, people who have that one sense of self, that's what they're seeking, is a coherence. And there is a way of looking at the commonalities to make them feel more comfortable that there's coherence. So looking more at the similarities rather than the differences can be helpful when you've got that type of client. So, talk through, tell me what your similarities are. And that starts to help them feel, I guess, less anxious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Richard Schwartz talks about the self with a capital S, the one that actually makes the decisions.
Yes.
I've heard another fantastic model, I forgot who was by, a client mentioned it, which is the inner team. People who have spent a lot of time in organizations, they understand that there can be a boardroom, and there's maybe nobody likes Karen or James from HR, but they actually have an important function, in the team. And maybe this person is too far out there, but you have your boardroom, but there's still somebody who makes the decisions in the end. And that's you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that is a useful analogy, actually, sometimes to think about your multiple identities as a team. And, that someone might be taking the lead one week and someone else the next. Yeah, that's quite a useful analogy.
Who's the health and safety inspector that, nobody likes, but it fulfills a very important function within the team.
Exactly. Yeah. No, excellent. I like that. I'm conscious there's one more bit that came out in my research that I found really, really interesting post-retirement. So I think just to sort of summarize the pre-retirement, post-retirement differences, I think pre-retirement was very practical, functional, quite surface, superficial. Post-retirement, the kind of topics that people were looking at were life appraisals. They were looking at rebalancing their time, their freedom. So really thinking deeply about how they were going to spend their time, not just I'm going to go and say so-and-so because I haven't for a long time, but I'm going to go and spend some quality time with this person because we've both got a love of X, so really thinking about why they're choosing to do what they were going to do. The identity piece, of course, that it always has lots of deep conversations. And, there was this sense that they needed someone in a one-to-one coach capacity to really explore their new identity, their old identity, whatever. And then the third bit that kind of came out post-retirement was this real challenge where they linked retirement with aging, and they just couldn't break the two apart. So lots of their language was about getting old rather than retiring. And there was this complete entanglement between the concepts and how they talked about it. And there was this sense that they were losing vitality. They feared death. So there was lots of kind of existential conversations that happened in their coaching environment, prompted by retirement. And there was one guy that said, all my life, my goal was retirement. Now my goal is death. Just that sense that there's I'm on my last chapter, and it really kind of all the thoughts that brings to someone when they're starting to think about ending their days. And for some that was really overwhelming, and for others it was really energizing. And they're like, I might not have long left, I need to get on and do things, that kind of mentality. But others found it very destructive for them, and destabilized them in terms of being able to move forward. So I imagine this is your area of expertise. So I'm interested in whether you've come across this kind of conversation linked with retirement.
Yeah, well, existentialists love talking about death stereotypically, right? And what we actually appreciate is that endings and temporality are a huge aspect in what people care about and what people what people want to avoid. So care about, and it's important to us, so important that we might deny it and would not want to talk about it. So I think this is part of the reason, and probably a big part of the reason, that people don't seek the conversation about their retirement, that people don't seek, because that means what's next. And as that participant of yours said very beautifully, now what's the next thing? It might not be traveling and finally relaxing for them. It might be, now it's the closest period of death. This is the last part of my life. I think this is part of why the death of a parent struck us so hard. Even those people who might not have a relationship with their parents, even. It's because now I'm next. Yeah. I'm the next in line, and that can be very scary. Exploring a client's relationship with endings in general, I think, will help them throughout a lot of things. But I think engaging them in a conversation about legacy or endings. What does it mean to die well? What do I still want to do? How much time do I think I have left? Because like many people live another 20, 30 years after retirement. That's huge. I mean, 20, 30 years in the beginning of your life, it feels like your whole life.
Yeah, exactly.
But we have the same time span with all the knowledge that we've already gathered. And yes, admittedly, some health issues and, the body starts decaying. Well, not decaying is maybe a strong word, but like we develop certain ails and we're not young anymore. But still, there's potentially so much time left and we have so much to give. Unfortunately, we also live in a society, at least in the UK here, where I feel like people who have retired or people who are in their later stages of life, they often get abandoned. They don't feel like a valuable part of society anymore. And my wife is Mexican, so there's, old people in Mexico are treated very, very differently. They're still very much involved and they're very much respected and valued for what they have experienced and the advice that they can give, or, the attitudes that they hold.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you raised this, because this was another massive finding, and something that I wasn't expecting. So one of the things I did alongside the interviews was, prior to the interview, I gave them, the barefoot coaching cards, and I said, pick some of these out just to kind of prompt their thinking. And quite a few of them chose this picture of an elderly Black woman, and she was in a setting that people perceived was a tribal setting. And there was so much warmth towards her. And they were talking about how wise she looked. She looked like she had lots of experience and how she was respected. And there's this lovely positive association with age by looking at this picture. And these conversations really flipped from this complete warmth towards this anti kind of ageist attitude within the West, and how they felt, exactly as you said, that we are not valuing our elderly people in any way like they do in other cultures. And as you say, Mexico's, they value their elders, and they have a big part to play in the family for a long time, and other cultures similarly. In fact, I think there's a law in China where kids have to look after their parents. Yeah, and in the UK, they talked about this sense of abandonment, and that they are put into retirement communities. They are kind of boxed away from society and not integrated into family life in the same way as other cultures. So there was this real angle that came out, and anyone who's doing research into anything, the power of using these photographs, I honestly don't think that cultural thought would have come up without those photographs. So it was really interesting to see the strength of the reaction towards that photograph, and how it opened this real anger about Western cultural aspects and how we treat the elves. Yeah.
Have you come across other research in different cultural contexts? Given that culture seems to be so important. Culture, not just in terms of a culture in another country, but also a culture in another family. A culture in another workplace. Have you come across culturally significant research?
Regarding retirement, no, I've come across articles, but nothing really, not substantial research. Have you?
No, I haven't.
No, so maybe there's a research opportunity there.
Well, this is where the research process kicks in, right? It's one study, and then somebody can try to replicate that study in a different cultural environment and see how are people in other cultural settings, in other organizations, or in other geographical cultures, religious cultures, perhaps, relate to transitioning into retirement.
I think there's definitely room for us to learn from other cultures. Certainly, I don't know why we are the way that we are, and I don't understand it, and I don't think we've always been this way. Mm-hmm. So I don't really understand why it's become this way, and I don't know whether it needs to stay this way. But there's some research. Actually, there's an organisation called the Centre for Aging Better in the UK, and they do quite a lot of research. And they've done some research to uncover that these cultural attitudes really do impact the health and well-being of people that are retiring. So because there's this sort of sense of abandonment within our culture, therefore you not just got the kind of mortality and vitality issues with getting old, but you've also got this abandonment issue. So there's so many things now linked to retirement that are negative for these people. Mm-hmm. There's a sense that it's actually impacting their psychological well-being. So that's what the research is showing at the moment. So I think we've all got a responsibility to respect our elders and understand the value that they bring.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing how like a systemic approach comes in, a developmental approach comes in here, a positive psychology approach comes in here. Narrative keeps popping up for me. Yeah. Feeling like a narrative approach to coaching could really help somebody craft their story so related to identity. Have you come across that?
Yes, no, I have, and in fact, that's one of the things that I do sort of put in my recommendations. That certainly, with regards to identity, the narrative approach would be a great way of recrafting who you are and who you want to present yourself as in your new future retiree identity. Because for some people, it is a completely different person. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and you have an opportunity to create that person, which I find really exciting.
Yeah,
who do you want to be?
I know. It's great. It's great. And I think that's what's missing at the moment is there doesn't seem to be much excitement about retiring. And I don't know why it has to be this kind of doom and gloom. It really doesn't. I think it's an exciting stage, you actually are dropping some of the shackles, like somebody said, one of my participants said, I'm dropping the requirement to earn, that kind of, you get this sense of freedom because you're no longer having to do that kind of 9 to 5 every day. You've got great opportunities. So I'd like to inject more enthusiasm into retirement.
Isn't that weird that we look forward to retirement as soon as we start working, and then the longer we work, we seem to look forward to it less and less because we've become so entangled our self-sense with our work.
Yes, no, it is interesting. And I wonder whether, somebody who hasn't got that same association with their work, whether actually when they retire, it's easier for them. I guess it is, but I don't know. Yeah.
I've had another question on here, which is, you said it's very important that the coach has a look at their sense of self. And I think there's some obvious reasons there, but I don't want to assume that they're obvious. So maybe you could just talk about why it's important for a coach to have to explore their sense of self.
Well, I guess this stems from when I first got interested in a sense of self, because at the point that I was doing that, had in my eyes, a unitary sense of self. So I felt, there was one authentic self. And this is when I met my coachee, who had this self that changed whenever she was in a different social situation. And I found that really kind of surprising. And that prompted me to investigate self models, etc. But the questioning that I had for her was from a place of having a unitary and authentic sense of self. So I was, all the questions I was asking made that assumption. So I guess it's being aware that there are other, and not changing your language to make assumptions from your own sense of self. So even a multiplicity, if you have a multiplicity, then, not assuming that in the other person, but just being open to explore everything.
Yeah, what a different question to ask somebody. If you say, tell me about yourself, or like, tell me about some of the different parts of yourself.
Yes, exactly. I know. And you'll get completely different answers, won't you?
Yeah. Imagine like, who are you at work? And then you ask, who are you at home? And then you ask, who are you with your friends? You're asking the questions based or informed by your perspective on self. And
exactly.
I think it's very important for coaches to understand, not just in terms of self and identity, what our questions are informed by, but being quite aware in general what our questions are informed by.
Yes.
I mentioned positive psychology coaching earlier. We don't need to follow a certain 10-step process or guide somebody through positive psychology interventions in order to be a positive psychology coach. Mm-hmm. Our questions can be informed by, well, what kind of happy do you mean when you say happy?
Yeah.
Tell me more about how you understand happiness, informed by happiness isn't one thing. It isn't just feeling good. There's all of these different pillars and foundations that contribute to happiness, which I know from science. And I'm curious about how you relate to that. But I'm not mentioning the theory. I'm not mentioning the science. I'm just, asking the question informed by what I know.
Exactly. No, I totally agree. Yeah.
Cool. And then, well, you talk about... you have two interesting phrases that you mentioned in your research: hunt it down or let it be. So can you tell us a bit more about what they mean and how that can help us coach people better?
Well, I guess it was this with the lost sense of self. It was this sense that if you have a unitary sense of self, that this utter kind of helplessness when you lose it, and this sense that you kind of need to find it again. Where is it gone? I need to hunt it down. I need to find out who I am. So it was really kind of playing with the different models of the self. So, hunting it down was about, if I have one self, then have I got to look for it to find it? Or do you just kind of accept that that self has gone, that work self and that work identity is no more. And, just accept that's, just let it be, just accept that time has passed and now you're a different identity. Or it could also be in the let it be, could be, that you have no self. So it was playing with the kind of the sense of there being lots of models of the self and how, you might feel that urge to hunt a self down, or you might not. And that is going to be informed by your own self model.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Before we move into some quickfire questions, or maybe not so quickfire questions, we'll see. Is there anything that you wanted to say about this topic that maybe I forgot to ask about, or it hasn't really flowed into that direction?
I don't think so. I think, I think we've covered most things. I think the only other point that I would make actually from a coaching perspective is that because of these different skills that were needed pre-retirement and post-retirement, what I found in my research was that actually all of the retirees engaged multiple coaches. So from 2 to 5. So that 5 is the maximum. And I thought it was quite interesting because talking to them about it, there were practical reasons why that was the case. So for some, it was that they didn't want that link with work anymore. So if the work had engaged an outplacement coach, or that they'd been on a retirement course and it was no more. So some of it was very practical as to the reason why they chose another coach. But others were seeking a skill set that they didn't feel the kind of more practical coaches could provide. So it's really a note for us as coaches that if we are working with retirees, that there may be a very different need pre-retirement to what they need post-retirement, and asking ourselves, are we best placed to flex between those needs, or do we need to accept that actually you're best placed in a pre-retirement role or a post-retirement role, and being honest with our coachees if that's the case, or being prepared to flex and adapt, which is my personal preference, which is why I love transitions, because I like to do that whole breadth of activities. I don't know, how are you? Do you like to do that too?
I love transitions because they present such an opportunity to do something different, but at the same time they're also really scary, and I really acknowledge how much courage it takes to change transitions. So talking about, often the opportunity is not really focused on. Often it can be forgotten because of the anxiety that pops up, of the not knowing, of the different stage. Even if it's not the last stage of your life, it's like it's the next stage of your life, and you're leaving behind what you know well.
Yeah.
So there is a reinvention, and many people, I think, see that as, I'm going to have to reinvent myself, or like I have to, let all of these things go. And I think often there's an underappreciation of, I get to let these things go, and I get to be somebody else, and I get to do things differently. Every ending is also an opportunity. It's also a new beginning.
Yeah.
So how do we relate to that? I think is a fascinating conversation, because if we do that well, and they understand their own relationship with endings and transitions and new phases, then the next significant transition will be much, much easier.
Yes.
It's not necessarily, it's not going to be easy necessarily, but it's going to be much easier. Imagine we do that early with the transition into, I don't know, from being 20 to being 30, or into having kids, or into like the end of a relationship, being single now, And if we work well with a client through transitions, then I think the transition into retirement, of course they're going to get a coach. Of course they're going to ask themselves those questions. Of course they're going to seek the conversations, or maybe seek the support of a group if they had positive experiences with that earlier transitions. And so existential.
Definitely.
Oh, there was one question I still wanted to ask, which was about rituals. I have a supervisee who works with rituals. He did a lot of research into indigenous tribes, and like lots of kind of rites of passage and these kind of things. So I wonder if you've come across this, or even use some of that in your coaching work to kind of mark the ending. If the company doesn't do it for you or with you, if there isn't that conversation, is it important, or, to mark this with some sort of ritual? If the company doesn't allow or doesn't invite you to have some sort of leaving shindig, I had to organize it myself when I left the university. And like some people do it, some people don't do it, some people hate doing it because that makes it official. But like, others do very private kind of rituals and mark it in their own way. Maybe they climb a mountain or whatever it is. Do you think that's important, or do you work creating that?
Yeah, I think it's vitally important. And I always think ending anything, it's a moment of reflection for some, a moment of celebration for others, and I think it depends on that experience for that individual. And their comfort zone in terms of whether they want to be in a massive social shindig or not. But, I think actually recognizing that end of a chapter is really important and can really help with going on to the next phase, because once you've kind of put that to bed, you feel much more ready to look forward. And I think if you don't do that, then it's got a potential of kind of creeping in and influencing what you do going forward, rather than kind of, if you've got regrets or, any negative feelings, they can kind of keep going into the future. Whereas really what you want to do is kind of go through that reflection process of thinking through all of those things and then recognizing them, accepting them, and then being prepared to move forward. So yeah, I absolutely think endings are really important. How about you?
Oh yeah, 100%. And I actually quite enjoy creating these. I usually set back, but I often offer the thought. Have you thought about marking this in some way?
Yeah.
And I'm not shy to kind of say, well, it can really help. It helped a lot of people that I know to just mark the occasion. And if you're not being supported to do that, have you thought about doing it yourself? And I think a lot of people haven't really considered that. And then once they do consider it, they actually get quite excited about creating something. And I love the creativity that goes in them, because it usually goes away from, oh, I'm going to do like an office leaving party, to like things that I would have never imagined. Like spending some time in nature, and like somebody wanted to go fishing, because that fishing trip just often marked the end of an era for this guy.
Oh, wonderful.
So that was very cool. And like, I couldn't have picked that out of a hat.
This is it. And I think what I mean is very personal to that person, isn't it?
Yes.
What's significant to them. And, like you say, I wouldn't have come up with fishing either.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. I thought that person was going to have a party. And then they said, I'm going to go fishing on my own. I'm like, oh, okay.
Okay. Excellent. I like that.
Yeah.
Good.
Cool. So a couple of questions. Feel free to take as much or as little time for them. What are some of the books or people that had a significant impact on that work that you're doing?
So one of my favorite books is Viktor Frankl's Sense of Meaning. So,
Man's Search for Meaning. Yeah,
Man's Search for Meaning. And I read that way back when. My first degree is in psychology. And so I've always been fascinated with that. But his sense of positivity, given the conditions that he was in at the time, because he was in a concentration camp the time.
Yeah, and some of the worst ones in Nazi Germany.
Yes, indeed. And he was able to think positively and helped other people to think positively. And I guess a lot of that was about the search for meaning and what, when you're in such a tragic situation, how you can still think positively about meaning and life and looking forward. So I found that a really powerful book. And also I think...
Hold on. I just wanted to throw in that question of what does life still expect from you? It was such a powerful question within his philosophy.
Yes.
It's like, not what can I still expect from life? Because I think when people are going into retirement, they often ask themselves that question.
Yes.
What can I still get out of life? And flipping the question of what does life still expect from you? I think it's such a powerful one to explore, because
it is.
Who are the people that might still really either depend on you or could really benefit from you, or could where could you really add value? And is that something you even care about? Because I think a lot of life ends early because people forget what they can contribute. And they feel, oh, there's nothing more to get from life, when actually there's a lot that they could still contribute. And that feeling of contribution leads people to hold on to life a lot longer and be healthier and live longer.
Yeah. No, exactly. And that's obviously what he went on to do, wasn't it? To contribute all his learnings. And I agree that sometimes we're a bit selfish in a way in terms of expecting too much, but like you say, it's a two-way traffic, and we need to give to get sometimes.
Yeah. And how great does it feel to give?
Oh, lovely. Yes. So that has been a essential book for me. And again, you can see the existential side of that resonated with me. I think there was another book, and I can't remember which one of the hostages wrote it. I don't know if it was Terry Waite, but it was one of those, which was their personal biography. But
wait, what hostages?
These were hostages. Now they were. So one of the guys was a priest, and the other one was a journalist. And I can't even remember the country. I think it might have been Iraq, but it was somewhere in the Middle East, and they were held hostages, and it became a big thing in the news. This was quite a while back, probably 20 years ago. Basically, the guy, they were had their heads covered with hessian sacks, so they couldn't see anything, and they were kept tied up in a dark cell. And one of these guys was reporting how when he was in those moments, he'd been beaten and tortured, etc., that he knew that the one thing that they couldn't take away was his thoughts. So it was that ability he used to go on walks in his head around his old village with his dog. And he used to use the power of the mind to have positive experiences whilst he was in this really devastating situation. Mm-hmm. So there's something that I really like about that, being positive no matter what.
Oh, basically. Wow. And I think the sheer wonders that the mind can offer you is like, what an incredible space to explore.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't think anybody will have explored their mind nearly as much as possible. And once you're going into retirement, I mean, just I had a moment in Mexico when I first visited Mexico, and things just move a little slower there. There were just these, these patches of like 10, 20 minutes that occurred very frequently where there was just nothing going on. We're just kind of waiting for somebody. Yeah. And if somebody tells me we're going to leave in 5 minutes, then 300 seconds later, I'll be there with my shoes on. Yeah. And then I was just like sitting on the sofa somewhere for like 10, 20 minutes until everybody else was ready. And just kind of start that was a huge step in my meditation practice, because just spending time with my own mind. And yes. I think when people move into retirement, where a lot of people will have less contact with other people or perhaps less things to do, not necessarily, absolutely. But like I would maybe it's the introvert in me, but I think I would be quite excited to get in some really interesting explorative practices and see what happens when I meditate, for like way longer than I currently have time for, because there's, a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah, no, agreed. And I think it's the power of the mind, isn't it? And the power that is interesting as well. The other thing that has really influenced me is my dad has severe dementia, and he's had it for like 8 years. So over the last 8 years, he was a doctor, a specialist. And he is now, he doesn't know who he is, what he is.
Ooh, speaking of lost sense of identity.
Yeah, exactly. So it's been, exactly. And I've watched his identity disappear. And that's been really fascinating, but disturbing as well. And also his sense of home. So, even when he was at home, he said, I want to go home. And it's that sense of wanting to go back to where you feel comfortable and back to your identity, where you know who you are. And I do feel like when he was saying those words, it's like I want to feel comfortable in myself. So it's very interesting. I've changed my concept of what home is now through my dad's kind of exploration, and just that understanding of whilst you've got your mind, explore it and love it and treat it with respect, because in 8 years my dad's has disappeared, and it's the thought that we could lose this amazing organ that we've got, and so use it whilst you can, basically. So
wow. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, no problem.
Wow. Yeah, makes you reflect on what, that the mind, it can disappear, you can still exist, exactly. but lose your sense of identity. What do you want to do before? Speaking of legacy, speaking of how much time we have, not just to live, but also with our sense of self. Exactly. Yeah. And you never expect to lose your identity in the same way that, my dad has. He never anticipated that.
But there's so many incidents of dementia nowadays. It's probably more likely than it's not.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Let's get this over with. I got the work to do.
Sorry.
Do you think the coaching profession should be regulated, or what do you think about regulation in the coaching space? Given especially that, coaches who work with people who are transitioning into retirement, there can be very vulnerable people.
Yeah. I have quite strong views on this, actually. Interestingly, I'm not attached to anyone currently in terms of a professional body. But when I entered into the coaching profession, I was obviously aware that there were quite a lot of people out there, and that, you can do a one-day course or more. So I deliberately went to do my master's for 2 years at Brooks to ensure that I felt comfortable that I was a credible coach before I went out into practice. So I've done that to kind of mark that kind of a sense of accreditation. But what I struggle with in the coaching profession as a totality is the number of professional bodies and the fact that they're almost obsessed with coaches and they're forgetting about the clients. And I struggle with this kind of almost infighting between the professional bodies to try and kind of attract you to them. And I just feel like the client voice has got lost in that competition. So at the moment, I'm fearful of being attached to one body because I don't feel alliance with any one particular body. I'd rather there was just one. Like the British psychologists. I mean, as I say, my first degree was psychology, so I'm really excited that they've got the new coaching psychologist kind of, and I'm definitely going to go for that because that is central to who I am, definitely, in terms of I love the psychology of coaching, and the fact that they're combining is just very exciting to me. So
talking about identity, yeah,
that's true. So I would love to do that, but I'm being quite picky about what I do because I really want to preserve the client voice. To me, that's so important. And I don't think if you're a corporate organization and you're going out to get a coach, I think you want definitely to be comfortable that who you're choosing is the right fit. So I think there's some way but it's very confusing for a client at the moment to understand what does it mean if you're AC versus EMCC versus ICF. What does that mean to me? I don't know. And I don't think there's enough consideration of their viewpoint and their perspective and how to help them understand how to kind of validate one coach versus another.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Clients generally don't care, right? Whether you're accredited with this or with that body, or whether you're a member versus accredited, or whether you have nothing to do with professional bodies. What they care about is whether you can help them and whether they trust you. And for some, it does make a difference whether you're accredited or a member in order to trust you. But for most, I don't think it plays a particular role.
But it's interesting with new generations coming through, whether that perspective might change. And whether they will be looking for more evidence.
Well, it's an opportunity to set yourself apart. And it's super interesting to point out that what's for the client here and what's for the coach. Because I can see that there's coaches out there who I want to be part of a professional body because I think they're good for the profession. And they keep coaches committed to keeping their clients in mind. They keep coaches committed to best practice. Their coaches are forced to do continuous professional development, which many coaches do because it's the right thing to do. But, the coaches with a professional body can only uphold their accreditation if they do that. So I think it's a good thing for the client as a concept in general. But also it can feel doctrinated, because there is an authority there. And it's interesting to see the different competency frameworks and the promotion of supervision, for example, at the moment. I really, really appreciate it. And I think they're doing a good service to the coaching industry, but it can also feel quite limiting if you don't agree with them.
I've just applied actually to do my supervision course, with the primary aim of kind of self-development within my coaching, actually, rather than becoming a supervisor. But just going back to professional bodies, I was talking to the IRCM because I was exploring all the different bodies that are out there. And have you heard of the IRCM?
IRCM? No, I don't think so. What does that stand for?
Well, it's International Regulation of Coaching and Mentoring. They are a body that is basically in charge of regulating coaching. That is their remit, to regulate coaching. Now, they're not quite there yet, but they're supported by the government to create that space. But nobody's heard of them, and there's not that kind of sense that we're going down a route into regulation at all. But there is a body that is looking at that. How do you regulate the industry? And all the kind of counselling and therapeutic industries have ended up going down that way. And I guess is that what's going to happen with coaching and mentoring? Maybe it is.
I think it depends. I mean, coaches go further and further into therapeutic territory, if we wanted to call it that. So I think the regulation becomes increasingly important as coaches work with more and more vulnerable clients. Because then really a body needs to step in and protect the client. With coaching, when we work with people who are quite resourceful and whole, and we do them a disservice, or we do something like, they're just not going to come back. So they didn't really need as much protection. But I think now that coaching branches out into doing quite a lot, much deeper work, I think it's quite important. But I can see how it's also limiting those who didn't spend, thousands and thousands of dollars, pounds, whatever currency in their coach training. And they do fantastic work with people, because they read a lot and they did a lot of training, and they have a lot of experience working with people, and they're just naturally very inclined to being very curious and holding fantastic space. You don't need the coach training in order to do some fantastic coaching. But also there's a lot of people who take a lot of risks. So it remains an interesting debate. Thanks for your comments.
Yes, indeed.
If someone asks you about the difference between coaching and therapy, what do you tell them?
That's a very good question. What do I tell them? It's very interesting because I'll tell you why. I was working with someone recently who I know was seeing a therapist. And so it was really important that we kind of contracted. And I haven't done much of that before. So it was really interesting to know, we had a couple of breakthroughs as a coach, and I wasn't expecting that, because I was, in a way, I was expecting the therapy to be doing the hard work and me to kind of be, just supportive. So it was very interesting to realize that actually you can have powerful breakthroughs in coaching with someone who is attending therapy. So in order to answer the question about the what do I say to someone, I don't think I've actually had that conversation other than to signpost, this is coaching and this is what I understand coaching to be. I am not your therapist, so I'm not here to try and look back into the past about why you are where you are today. I'm much more future focused and looking at how we can use all the tools that you've got to look forward. So I kind of do it based on time, I guess, more than anything, and try and sort of say that therapy is much more about looking at the source and origin of issues, and coaching is more about looking forwards as to how you can use your tools to have the most fulfilled life. So that's how I do it.
Cool, thank you. Do you notice any current or future trends that might be that might be interesting to you? Anything that you notice in the coaching profession underway, or perhaps on the horizon?
Well, I see there's quite a growth in team coaching, which I think is really important. But as you say, generations with their more kind of search for meaning and value, I think there's a lot more space for us to kind of work with these youngsters on life values and appraisal and legacy, etc. I think there's more that we can do, and I honestly believe that earlier you can do it, the better life will be when you get to retirement, and that transition will be a lot easier. So I think there's more that we can do with youngsters now. I think they're more open to have those conversations. So I would like to see HR looking much more at looking at the whole person at work rather than just the person who presents at work, and helping them figure out fits, etc., so that later on they're equipped to know what they might want to do come retirement. But I do think there are lots of things like retirement courses, that we've got an aging population, and by 2050 about 25% of the UK will be over 60. So we've got with that in mind, then I would like to see there to be more retirement courses and more focus on how we handle that transition in the most sensitive and graceful way that we can.
Yeah, I'd love to see that too.
Mm-hmm.
Next one is, well, without breaking confidentiality, obviously, can you tell me about your most memorable client? Could be related to the retirement space, the retirement coaching, could be any other client as well.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Most memorable client. I think it was probably the one that I've already mentioned, to be honest, because it sent me off down this journey of understanding the self. And it was that real shock and a realization that I had a completely different view of myself to the one that she held. And so, it's that real recognition of how much your clients can teach you. And I'm forever grateful for her for taking me down that journey into an area which I find personally very satisfying. So yes, I think I've already mentioned her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the amount we learn from our clients. It's amazing. They often don't realize how much we take away from the work, I think.
It's very interesting you say that, because at what point have I told her that she's done that? I don't think I have. So I will make a note to do that.
I tend to make an effort at the end to just appreciate the client and how much I've taken from that. And the stuff that's not really appropriate to bring into the space, or it's not helpful to the client necessarily. Sometimes it is, sometimes it can be really important that they know that this is a two-way relationship, but it depends on the context. But I tend to make an effort at the end to just, share some of my experiences about how valuable this was to me as well, and what I'm taking away, because I think it helps clients to feel really connected with us and with the work as well.
Of course. Yeah, agreed.
Have you ever had to stop working with a client part way through the coaching agreement?
Part way through, out of my choice rather than their choice?
Yeah.
No. I've recontracted, but I haven't stopped. No, maybe I should have done.
Oh, interesting.
No, but I guess I consider myself quite an adaptable coach. Yeah. I'm quite comfortable putting on lots of different hats, and I will only go as deep as my client is comfortable to deep, but I'm quite prepared to go very deep. Yeah. But I'm also quite happy being, very kind of planning and practical. So I think it's perhaps my ability to adapt that means that I don't have that situation arising. I do note that sometimes I have to recontract, but other than that, no. Obviously, clients have chosen to stop coming to coaching at points, but not through my own choice.
Right. Thank you. And lastly, and feel free to take a moment to think about this, if you could take over the screen of any person or group of people, including the whole world, so it could be the whole world, could be a specific group of people or a specific person, and you're just in front of them, whether they have a device or not, and you have their undivided attention for a minute, what would you tell them and why?
What would I tell them and why? I guess I'm assuming I can talk to people that are dead and alive.
Yes.
So yeah, I would probably send my appreciation to Mr. Frankel and basically thank him for really a theme that has run throughout my own life. And, when I've been in my own personal situations, which have been very dark and miserable, how he has helped me to see the positive in everything. And I think I wouldn't class myself as a positive psychologist necessarily, but I do think his perspective has had a profound impact on the way I see things and the way that I can bring energy to bring myself out of, tough situations and other people out of tough situations. So I do feel like his book has been such a profound impact on my life. So yes, it would be him, and it would be a thank you.
Wonderful.
Definitely. Who would you say?
Oh, I think I might answer that at some point. It varies on the day.
Okay, fair enough.
Today, I would probably send a message to all becoming parents, and so that they to talk to each other about this transition.
Okay.
Because
is there a reason for that?
Yeah, we're expecting in February.
Congratulations!
So we've just had a session with our doula yesterday, and just started talking about things, and we talk a lot, but I think it just strengthened the importance of having conversations about the transition into being parents, not just birth, but particularly what happens after the birth. What are your hopes and fears? Who am I going to be afterwards? Yeah. And I think having those conversations also with my own coach it's an important part. So being as transitions and the session being very present, I think that's a message I would send to parents.
That's wonderful. And you will learn so much from becoming a parent. You will learn more than you thought was possible.
Yeah. I know that. And at the same time, I know that I have no idea. So thank you. Where can people find you and your work? Or are there any projects you want to tell people about?
Yeah, so I think probably the best place to point everyone is to www.north52.com. And there's a dash between the North and the 52, which is very important. And basically, as I say, I'm working with two colleagues. There's a bit about my profile on there if anyone wants to find out any more, but a bit about the work that we do. But also, we're really looking at some specific areas of coaching and mentoring and how we can enhance kind of what corporates offer to their colleagues. And retirement will be coming on there shortly as one of the tools that we will be offering. So if anyone's interested in anything to do with transitions, particularly to retirement for me, then that's the starting point.
I love that. Thank you so much, Tessa, for taking the time to talk to us today and share your research. I'm sure there's been a lot of thoughts running around as people have been listening to this. If anybody's out there, if you're out there and you want to continue the conversation, you can do that in a couple of spaces. I've dropped a couple of links wherever you see this podcast, so you can follow it up because this is not just a conversation between Tessa and I. We want this to be a conversation for the community so that other people feel part of this conversation. And whether you want to share your thoughts or not, I always say the more we talk, the more we learn. And there are spaces out there where we as coaches can get together, have these conversations, share our experience. If you're in a different culture, you're doing transition coaching, particularly into retirement, I'm sure Tessa would absolutely love to hear from you.
Definitely, yes. Definitely.
If there's researchers out there who want to do this, or if you want to take part in more research, reach out. Maybe there's some opportunities. Maybe there's somebody who wants to do some research into this. Maybe there's other coaches who do this, who want to figure out what's the right kind of tool or what's the right kind of process. What can an existential lens offer my work, perhaps? Let's have that conversation. So,
brilliant. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tessa.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
Bye.